All right, so here we go. The final installment of the Imperialism Notes. Let's bring this cheeky little monkey home. Now, the good news is there's a very good chance that this is the last bit of notes for probably the rest of the year. I mean, certainly until the AP exam. My goodness, my. Here we go. This is going to be the short one, too. All right, so imperialism, as you can imagine, probably very unpopular with everyone other than Europeans. High five, India. All right, so we're going to look at India as our kind of our model, as our sample, and then I'm going to give you just a couple other examples, and then I'm going to wrap this thing up like a nice little present. Okay, so in India, I'm going to give you kind of a progression of events, starting with the Sepoy revolts. So what happened was, in the 1800s, we have revolts that take place, and basically it's in response to, this is kind of ironic, but it's an important thing. There were allegations that the British had put pig and cow fat in the cartridge stock of their ammunition rounds. And so Sepoy soldiers were refusing to use the bite-off cartridge because they didn't want to get the pig and cow fat in their mouths. And that comes down to, in Hinduism, right, they're not supposed, I mean, cows are sacred, so they're not going to do that. And then for Muslims, they're not supposed to touch or be in contact with pigs or pork. And so for both sides, it's considered offensive, right? So they wouldn't do this. All right, so 1858, some wars break out, revolts are fought, and it kind of actually has a unifying effect in India because the Hindus, the Muslims kind of agree that they don't like the British. Some of the little local princes that are trying to figure out what to do after the death of the Mughal Empire, they all kind of combine to oppose Britain. Now, ultimately, they fail in a bloody, hard-fought revolution or revolt, but it convinces Queen Victoria in England to scrap the East India Company and rule India directly. Okay, so then we move ahead. Ram Mohan Roy is considered the father of modern India, and basically he's a stepping stone to more aggressive types of Indian independence. And so what he really represents is this idea of European educated elites that are Indian pushing for greater control in their country. And so he used Hinduism as a cultural base, but he wanted to actually kind of use European science and technology to create like a hybrid successful society. And kind of what I think is most important, or what shows his ideas, is that he was writing and publishing in newspapers. He advocated ending archaic and barbaric treatment of women. For example, the sati, where they would burn the widow of a dead man on his funeral pyre, beating of women, gang rape. I mean, like, women had very low rights traditionally in India. And so wanted to see an elevation of there, and an elevation of property rights and property law, things from the Enlightenment and kind of classical liberalism that were well established in Europe. Now, those ideas then fueled other groups like the Indian National Congress. Pictured here is their flag, which is close to the Indian flag now, right? And really what happened there is England was willing to allow local representation. And so in India, we had mainly a Hindu representation in the Indian National Congress at start. And they would share their frustrations: poverty, trade policies, famine, issues of taxation. And so they would share those concerns. Well, eventually, other groups like the All India Muslim League kind of combined their focus. And really what we see is a push for home rule. And home rule was a concept popular at the time. In Ireland, also being dominated by the British at the same time, we're asking for the ability to control local matters, but still remain under British imperial control. And that's kind of what India was advocating, was greater autonomy at home. Now, as this was going on, though, a lot of the common population of India were becoming more radical than that. And so we noticed a rapid escalation in nationalism or what they call decolonization in India. And so we notice kind of a terrorist campaign of bombings and assassinations of British politicians, massive demonstrations in the different provinces, and we're talking like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in these protests. Now, I'm zooming way ahead here. This is after the Great War, after World War I. But the Amritsar massacre happened as Indians were advocating for better treatment, lower taxes on things like salt, and they were unarmed, and British officers just got twitchy and fired into the crowd, killing 400. Well, that's literally 100 years after the Peterloo massacre, where the British did the same thing to other working class British people. So still hanging on to the ghosts of the industrial age. And by 1922, then, people like Gandhi, who were witnessing these struggles, advocated for peaceful civil disobedience, things like hunger strikes, and passive resistance. All right, so that would be another way to kind of illustrate that. And so here's the Amritsar massacre, where we see people being mowed down. So here's the British just going at them. All right, now other responses. We look across the time period, and we notice that nationalism and decolonization were common at this time. And sadly, they all were kind of universally struggling, and it really doesn't change much until a little bit after World War I, and for most nations after World War II. So my example of India from before, in 1947, so 2 years after the conclusion of World War II, India finally gains its independence. All right, and so we notice across Africa, in places like the Sudan, the Omdurman revolts, and we have 20,000 Sudanese killed in the span of just a couple hours by a couple hundred Brits. Again, it's the superior firepower. These failures weren't just in Africa and Asia, and it's not proof of white being right or racist ideology, because the same type failures were taking place in, again, places like Ireland as they fought for home rule. So in 1916, there was what they called the Easter uprisings or the Easter Rebellion, and same result. Right? Several hundred revolutionaries tried to really impose freedom from Britain, and it resulted with a whole bunch of people being artillery shelled and machine gunned to death and public execution. So that was kind of typical. Now, popularism and education and higher standards of living actually are going to help people here. And we notice something kind of new. This is new. This is a change in history. Public opinion mattering. And that shows, one, that government is more receptive to the needs of the people. And it also shows the growing power of the people and the education of the people and the power of things like newspapers. And so what I'm talking about is in the Belgian Congo. See, I told you I'd come back to it. In the Belgian Congo, those horrors that were taking place in the Belgian Congo were not going unnoticed. And so a missionary lady working in the Congo by the name of Alice Seeley Harris had this weird encounter. So she was working at her station, and this man came up to her and had this weird package in his hands, and he showed it to her, and it ended up being the severed feet of his daughter. And she was obviously terrified. And he asked her to come to his village and witness firsthand the stacks of human hands and feet. And she witnessed the brutality of what the Belgians were doing in the Congo, the brutal nature of their regime. And so these photos ended up being published globally and creating a real campaign against the Belgian Congo. Now, people like Mark Twain, famous author of Tom Sawyer, right, also catches this, and he starts writing about it. And eventually something called the Congo Reform Association is created. And what I'm showing is the power of literature, right? People are reading newspapers and books so much that we're consuming these ideas, and people are accessing newspapers and magazines at such a frequency that they're seeing these pictures, and more people, millions of people globally, are coming into contact and going, oh my God, I never knew how bad this was. And governments were forced to come clean with their people, right? Or lose the support of their people. And this could teeter on revolution and revolt at home. And so eventually, right, media and popularism actually forces accountability of government. All right, let's bring this thing on home. So the last thing we want to talk about, the final thing to bring this in, is the impact it had on movement of people. All right, all of this imperialism, all of this industrialization just ramps up. I mean, it gets migration moving like we haven't seen before. Yes, we saw great migrations of people many other times. So we talk about African slave trade during the Age of Exploration, and something, to the effect of like anywhere between 8 to 15 million Africans being forced into migration. What we're talking about at this period of time is something probably within 100 to 115 years of time that's looking at maybe as much as globally, like 100 million people moving. All right, so in Europe alone, something like 50 million people leave Europe. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, and I'm going to break those down into two different ways of looking at it: push and pull factors. So in Europe, there were push factors, in essence, kicking them in the butt and telling them to get out, right? I mean, things that were very undesirable that were driving them away. And so a lot of that was land was just too expensive. Most common working class people couldn't afford property. They couldn't buy land. They couldn't afford a house. There was nowhere to go. There was always a ceiling keeping them down. Also, the 1840s were a time of great famine and of great revolution. All across Europe in the 1830s and 40s, we had major droughts, horrible harvests of potatoes in Ireland, and we had nationalist and liberal revolutions. And so whether it was based on your political viewpoints or the emptiness of your stomach, people no longer felt safe in Europe. And for your local craftsmen, industrial production was making you useless, superfluous, and so they moved to places where they could matter. Now, pull factors. What was drawing them in? What was the super spice in the world that was getting people interested? Well, in a place like America, was cheap land. So much land that they were literally giving it away for free. And in doing so, that meant that people who were locked out of that kind of lifestyle all of a sudden felt like they had a chance for social mobility, more freedom. In America, but this is true in a lot of places in the world, heavy construction and transportation provided a lot of jobs, right? So in America, we had the Transcontinental Railroad. And I'm showing you an image here of Chinese Americans working on the railroad. They sometimes referred to it as Paddy Power or Irish Power. But it was kind of a magnet for immigrants to work on these super dangerous, low paying, but paying jobs. And so immigrants literally build the infrastructure of America, right? So the Transcontinental Railroad, not different than really what we see in South Africa and Central Africa, where the British would bring in Indian Hindus and Muslims from India to help build railroads across the continent of Africa as well. Okay, now the other style of migration taking place was something they referred to as indentured labor. It's like indentured servitude, except it's not like work for freedom. These are free people choosing to work, but choosing to work in very low paying, hard, difficult jobs. And so again, much like I'm showing you here, and I just explained previously, right? So it was more common to see Indians, some Chinese, Japanese, people who were ethnically traditional and didn't want to see things like the Meiji Restoration get too modern. They would flee Japan or their home countries in search of jobs, oftentimes in sugar plantations or cotton and tea plantations, oftentimes building the railroads. And so a continuity is migration. A continuity is labor and the need for labor to increase empire and modernity. A difference, it's not slavery. These are wage earners, but not so much better than slavery necessarily. The other major difference, right, is a lot of this is now based on technological advancements. We're no longer laboring just on cash crops, although we are still doing that, but we're building canals and railroads and infrastructure to create a more modern global experience. And so my last slide here is just this map that kind of shows the different trends all across the globe of where people are moving. And so massive exodus out of Europe, many coming to North America, but also to South America and over to Australia. But here we see some of that indentured labor leaving from India, China, and Japan to come to places like Africa, the Americas, and Australia. All of this really stemming back to exploration, stemming back to the early Indian Ocean trade and the spice routes that were influenced in 1453 by the shutdown of Constantinople, and they went to the seas, and so it required labor here, and so slave labor traveled there, and we had a triangle trade, and eventually that put the material benefits in the hands of the Europeans, so they industrialized first, and that industrial wealth required more and more raw materials, which they sucked out of these places through new imperialism, which ultimately meant that these surplus populations needed somewhere to go, and so back to the New World. It's a weird 400-some year circuit, but it all does kind of come full circle. I hope that makes sense. That is it for the 2020 exam-worthy information, and now we can focus on documents, reading and writing skills, get this DBQ game working. Ooh, get the spice. And then we're going to crush this exam. All right, guys. Great talking. Hope to see you soon. All right, bye.